Who's really behind the attacks on Mali? Are we just looking at militant groups who thrive on chaos, or is there a more sinister force pulling the strings? Mali has once again come under fire, and it's becoming clear that the blame can't be pinned on just one group. The attackers aren't even all homegrown. Some of the most vocal champions of human rights seem to have a hand in this too. So, who are these hidden players stirring up trouble in Mali? Could it be that those who preach peace and democracy are secretly fueling the instability? Let's find out. On September 17th, Mali's capital, Bamako, was rocked by a series of brutal attacks. Militants launched coordinated assaults on key military installations, claiming 77 lives and shaking the nation to its core. This was not just an act of insurgency, but a stark reminder of the fragility of a country that has long been plagued by insurgency and political instability. Colonel Assimi Goita, who came to power after 2 military coups, vowed to bring order and security to Mali. Yet, as these attacks reveal, his government is struggling to live up to these promises. But what led to this failure? Is there someone behind it?
Several military personnel killed in a military training camp in Mali's capital, Bamako, which came under attack on Tuesday. Malian army said that the terrorists attempted to infiltrate the Falade Grand Army School in the large explosions and gunshots were heard in the nearby areas.
Who doesn't just want to attack Mali, but wants you to think Mali is incapable? Mali's crisis didn't begin overnight, but in recent years, the situation has worsened significantly. Who is to blame for this? Militants, the government, or both? The story of Mali's crisis is often told in simplistic terms. The government has failed, or militants are tearing the country apart. However, the true narrative is more nuanced. It's not just about who has dropped the ball internally. It's about the systemic exploitation and interference that has strangled Mali for decades. The real question is, can we truly blame the Malian government and militants without looking at the larger forces at play, forces that have shaped and exploited Mali for years? Firstly, let's consider the militants. Groups are often seen as the obvious culprits in Mali's instability. But here's the thing. These groups are symptoms, not causes. They thrive in environments where governance has been deliberately weakened and where borders and stability have been manipulated to serve foreign interests. These insurgents did not emerge in a vacuum. They arose in the wake of decades of Western interference, including the destruction of Libya in 2011, which unleashed fighters and weapons into Mali and its neighboring regions. Western powers may now decry the rise of jihadist groups, but they played a significant role in setting the stage for their emergence. And why? Because chaos breeds control. A destabilized Mali, overrun by militants, ensures that foreign interests, primarily France and its Western allies, can maintain a grip on the country's vast resources, from gold to uranium. A stable and self-sufficient Mali would challenge the economic foothold that these powers have enjoyed for far too long. So, while militants are indeed causing destruction, they are a byproduct of a larger geopolitical game where Western nations have manipulated instability to their advantage. But let's not overlook the role of Mali's government. The state has undeniably struggled with corruption, mismanagement, and a lack of political inclusion, especially in the northern and central regions. For years, Bamako's government has been too focused on maintaining power rather than addressing the needs of marginalized communities. This has created a vacuum, one that insurgent groups have exploited by offering an alternative to a government that many perceive as neglectful. However, placing all the blame on the government would be an oversimplification. What needs to be recognized is that the Malian government has, in many ways, been a puppet of Western powers, especially France, which continued to exert influence over the country's military, economic, and political affairs long after colonialism officially ended. Western-backed leaders were installed to maintain the illusion of sovereignty, but in reality, many of these leaders served foreign interests more than their people. For example, let's talk about France's Operation Barkhane, launched under the guise of fighting insurgency. This military operation wasn't just about battling insurgents, it was about securing France's access to resources while keeping Mali dependent on foreign military aid. The Western security solutions put in place, often without consulting Malians, did nothing to address the root causes of the insurgency: poverty, marginalization, and the exploitation of resources. By focusing solely on military action and ignoring the need for economic and social reforms, these interventions have perpetuated the cycle of violence. But the most glaring question remains: who benefits from a destabilized Mali? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. It certainly isn't the people of Mali. The real beneficiaries are those who continue to profit from the country's resources and geopolitical position while avoiding accountability for the chaos. In this light, one cannot overlook the role of neocolonial forces in keeping Mali on the edge of chaos. France, for instance, still exerts economic dominance through the CFA franc, a currency controlled by the French treasury, which ensures that Mali's economic policies remain subservient to French interests. Moreover, the IMF and World Bank, which are dominated by Western nations, have imposed economic policies that prioritize foreign investment and extraction of resources over Mali's domestic growth. These structural adjustments have left Mali vulnerable, making it difficult for any government, no matter how capable, to address poverty or create a stable economy. When a country's sovereignty is continuously undermined, it's impossible to build the kind of institutions needed to combat militancy or corruption effectively. So, who is to blame? The militants? Absolutely, but only as instruments in a much larger game. The Malian government? Yes, it has failed in many respects, but it has also been sabotaged by the very powers that claim to support it. The real responsibility lies with external actors: Western governments, multinational corporations, and financial institutions that have profited from Mali's instability while pretending to be its saviors. The crisis in Mali is not the result of a few bad leaders or violent militants. It is the result of a systematic stripping away of sovereignty, orchestrated by those who benefit from a weakened Mali. To truly solve this crisis, the focus must shift from placing blame on Mali's internal actors to dismantling the neocolonial systems that keep the country in perpetual conflict. Only then can Mali have a chance to rebuild itself as a truly independent nation, free from the hidden hands that have controlled its fate for too long. We now know what Mali is thinking, but what does the West have to say about the attack? The international community, particularly Western powers like France, was swift to condemn the attacks in Bamako. On the surface, their statements of concern seem like a typical diplomatic response, denouncing the violence and calling for peace. But let's be real, this condemnation is anything but sincere. It's part of a long-standing pattern where Western nations criticize Mali, not out of concern for its people, but as a way to deflect responsibility and maintain control over the narrative. The real question isn't why they condemn the attack. It's why they keep blaming Mali for its instability, and what they stand to gain from doing so. To understand the emptiness behind the West's condemnation, we must first examine the hypocrisy that lies at the heart of their actions. France, for instance, has long maintained a presence in Mali under the pretense of counterinsurgency, primarily through Operation Barkhane, a military mission aimed at combating militant groups in the Sahel. However, despite years of involvement, the situation in Mali has only worsened. Instead of helping stabilize the country, French operations have fueled resentment among Malians and allowed insurgent groups to thrive. Yet, when things fall apart, like the recent Bamako attack, the Western powers quickly point fingers at Mali, as if it's solely the government's fault for not controlling the chaos. But why do they blame Mali so persistently? The answer lies in control. By casting Mali as a nation that can't manage its affairs, Western powers justify their continued interference under the guise of helping or protecting democracy. It allows them to prop up their military presence and economic influence without taking responsibility for the instability they helped create. Blaming Mali serves as a convenient scapegoat, diverting attention from the fact that their interventions, whether military or economic, have done more harm than good. Let's not forget that France and other Western nations have strategic interests in keeping Mali in a state of dependency. Mali's rich natural resources, gold, uranium, and other minerals, are a major draw for foreign powers. The more unstable Mali becomes, the more justification these powers have to remain involved, extracting resources while maintaining the facade of benevolence. The attacks in Bamako offer the perfect opportunity for these nations to blame Mali's government for its failure to control the insurgency, while simultaneously absolving themselves of any responsibility for their role in perpetuating the chaos. Western condemnation also serves a political purpose. By blaming Mali's government, particularly under Colonel Assimi Goita, Western powers aim to discredit Mali's leadership on the international stage. Goita's government has made bold moves toward reclaiming Mali's sovereignty, most notably by expelling French troops and turning to Russia's Wagner Group for security assistance. This shift in alliances has infuriated Western powers, especially France, which sees Mali's pivot toward Russia as a direct threat to its influence in the region. The West's condemnation is, therefore, not just a response to the attacks, it's a strategic action to undermine Goita's legitimacy. By blaming his administration for the attacks and labeling Mali as unstable, the West seeks to portray Goita as incapable of leading the country. This is part of a larger effort to destabilize his government and ensure that Mali remains within the West's sphere of influence. After all, a Mali that aligns itself with Russia threatens the existing power dynamics in West Africa, where France and other Western nations have long enjoyed dominance. And what do they want to prove? By constantly blaming Mali, Western powers want to prove a point: that African nations like Mali cannot govern themselves without Western guidance. It's an insidious form of neocolonialism, where the narrative is framed to suggest that Africans are incapable of solving their problems, and therefore need Western intervention. This mentality not only discredits the efforts of Mali's government, but also disempowers the Malian people, perpetuating the idea that they cannot stand on their own 2 feet. But Mali's recent actions tell a different story. Goita's government is striving to reclaim Mali's sovereignty, moving away from Western dependency and towards self-reliance. The Wagner Group partnership is a clear example of Mali seeking security solutions that prioritize its interests rather than those of foreign powers. Yet, this move has been met with criticism and suspicion from the West, which fears losing its grip on Mali's resources and strategic position in the Sahel. What the West is trying to prove by blaming Mali is that without their involvement, Africa will descend into chaos. This narrative is not only false but dangerous. It perpetuates a cycle of dependency that keeps African nations like Mali from achieving true sovereignty. The truth is, the West benefits from an unstable Mali. As long as Mali remains fragile, the door stays open for Western nations to justify their continued presence, extracting wealth while pretending to help. So, is their condemnation sincere? Hardly. It's a calculated move to maintain control, protect their interests, and undermine any attempts by Mali to break free from the chains of neocolonialism. Mali, under Goita's leadership, is fighting back. The West's empty words of condemnation are nothing more than a smokescreen, masking their true intentions: to keep Mali and other African nations locked in a state of perpetual dependency. With the international community's response leaving much to be desired, let's turn to Colonel Goita. Has he delivered on his promises of stability, or is he being unfairly blamed for a mess created by decades of external meddling? Colonel Assimi Goita has faced immense pressure since coming to power in August 2020, following 2 military coups that overthrew a government widely seen as corrupt and ineffective. He promised to stabilize Mali, restore order, and put the country on a path to recovery. But as Mali continues to face insurgency and unrest, the Western narrative has been swift to portray Goita as a failure. The truth, however, is far more complex and deeply tied to Mali's colonial legacy and decades of external meddling. To truly assess Goita's performance, we must first acknowledge the enormous challenges he inherited. The government he overthrew was deeply enmeshed in corruption, propped up by Western interests that cared little for the well-being of ordinary Malians. France and other Western powers supported these regimes because they were willing to prioritize foreign economic interests over the needs of their people. The legacy of these governments left Malians disillusioned, distrustful of the state, and increasingly vulnerable to the rise of militant groups in the northern and central regions. Goita stepped into a power vacuum left by a failed political system and decades of foreign manipulation. The insurgency he inherited wasn't a problem of his making. It was exacerbated by the collapse of Libya in 2011, which unleashed arms and militants into the Sahel, and further fueled by France's misguided counterinsurgency policies. Rather than empowering Mali to develop its security infrastructure, France's Operation Barkhane focused on securing French interests while failing to address the root causes of the insurgency. Goita was left to deal with the aftermath, a country with a weakened military, fractured governance, and regions under militant control. So, has he delivered on his promises of stability? It depends on how you define success. If stability means the immediate cessation of violence and a swift return to civilian rule, then no, Goita has not achieved that. Nor could anyone in his position, given the enormity of the task at hand. But if stability means taking the first steps toward true sovereignty and restoring Mali's independence, then Goita has made significant progress. One of the most notable aspects of Goita's leadership has been his decision to break from France and other Western powers that have long dictated Mali's security and economic policies. His administration's decision to expel French forces and end Operation Barkhane sent a clear signal. Mali was no longer willing to be a puppet of foreign interests. This was a bold move, one that few leaders before him dared to take. In turning to Russia's Wagner Group for security assistance, Goita has sought to reclaim control over Mali's military strategy and pursue partnerships that serve Mali's interests, rather than those of former colonial powers. Of course, this decision has been met with intense criticism from the West. Western governments, particularly France, have painted Goita's alignment with Russia as reckless, accusing him of undermining democracy and exacerbating instability. But let's be clear, the instability Mali faces today is the result of years of external interference, where Western powers prioritize their economic and geopolitical goals over Mali's security and development. The neocolonial tactics of France, controlling Mali's resources while offering military support that perpetuated dependency, created a situation where Mali could not stand on its own 2 feet. Goita is being unfairly blamed for a mess that was not of his making. His administration is trying to clean up after decades of exploitation, corruption, and dependency, and that process is slow and difficult. The insurgencies that plague Mali cannot be solved overnight, especially when the root causes of poverty, disenfranchisement, and regional inequality are ignored by previous regimes. Goita is attempting to address these issues while also rebuilding a military that was gutted by years of foreign dependency. Western criticism of Goita's delays in returning to civilian rule is another tactic used to undermine his legitimacy. The reality is that holding elections in a country ravaged by insurgency and weakened by external forces would only lead to more instability. Goita's decision to delay elections until 2025 is not a power grab. It is a recognition that Mali needs time to rebuild its institutions, restore security, and create the conditions necessary for a peaceful transition to civilian rule. Rushing the process would only lead to another cycle of violence and political instability, as seen in other nations where elections were held under duress. Goita has shown a commitment to sovereignty, self-determination, and addressing the root causes of Mali's instability. It's unfair to judge his administration solely by the immediate security situation, given the deeply entrenched problems he inherited. His leadership should be viewed in the broader context of Mali's fight for independence from neocolonial influence. The real question isn't whether Goita has delivered stability overnight. It's whether he's laying the foundation for long-term stability by reclaiming Mali's sovereignty and charting a path forward that prioritizes the needs of the Malian people. Now comes a question. Can West be behind all this? Some suggest that Western powers may have had a hand in the recent attacks in Bamako, but is there any evidence to support this? Could a nation that preaches human rights truly be involved in such an act? When it comes to geopolitics, things are rarely as they seem. While Western powers, particularly France and the United States, often position themselves as champions of human rights and democracy, history shows that these same nations have been involved in covert operations that serve their strategic interests, even if it means destabilizing nations that stand in their way. So, the question arises, could Western powers have been involved in the Bamako attacks? And if so, why? Let's start by acknowledging that it's not uncommon for powerful nations to interfere in the affairs of others. Western powers, particularly France, have long been accused of meddling in Africa's political landscape. France's influence in the Sahel, while presented as a counterinsurgency effort, has also served its economic and political interests. It's no secret that France has a deep-rooted interest in maintaining control over West Africa's resources, from uranium in Niger to gold and other minerals in Mali. In the past, Western nations have resorted to clandestine methods to protect their interests, even if it means destabilizing governments they find unfavorable. The 2011 Libyan intervention is a prime example, where NATO-backed forces overthrew Muammar Gaddafi, leading to chaos that spilled into the Sahel and fueled militant groups. The aftermath of this Western intervention has had a direct impact on Mali, with arms and fighters flooding into the region. This shows that Western powers are willing to engage in destabilizing activities when it suits their strategic interests, even if it comes at the cost of African stability. The narrative of human rights and democracy, often championed by Western governments, is frequently used as a facade. It allows these powers to justify their actions on the global stage while concealing their true motives. The West has a long history of backing coups, insurgencies, and destabilization efforts in countries that challenge their influence. Could Mali be the next target? Let's not forget that Mali's decision to expel French forces and turn to Russia's Wagner Group may have ruffled feathers in the West. Could these attacks be part of a larger effort to destabilize Mali and discredit Goita's leadership? History tells us it's possible. Though there's no direct conclusive evidence that Western powers orchestrated the Bamako attacks, the timing and the impact are suspicious. These attacks struck at a time when Mali was working to consolidate its sovereignty and resist foreign interference. They targeted key military installations that are crucial to Mali's efforts to rebuild its security infrastructure, which is now independent of Western military support. The devastation caused by these attacks undoubtedly weakens the Malian government, raising questions about who benefits from such chaos. Who do you think wants to prove the junta leader is not capable? Who do you think is behind the instability in Mali? Let us know in the comments section. Do you think West wants to help? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.